Getting Started Internationally, Unit 2 from Chapter 5, Lesson 1, Part 2.
Multinational companies are undoubtedly increasing in size and influence. One estimate has it that multinational companies increased from a number of 3,000 to 63,000 between 1990 and 2003 alone. So the question these companies have to ask themselves is, how do we get started? And there are several options available. The easiest and cheapest option is exporting. They can create the product in their home market and ship it for sale in foreign markets. The next option is outsourcing. This can also be called, in the specific context, offshoring. So work activities that can be done cheaper somewhere else can be outsourced. Think about the call center in India. Another option is licensing. If you think about Coca-Cola or SAB Miller, they have one recipe for a certain product, but they are not manufacturing and exporting it. Rather, they have bottling plants in the key regions where they operate, and they license the recipe there so that it can be made in that country and sold in that region. Another option is franchising. So this is licensing that provides a very complete package of materials and services. And we see this particularly in the fast food industry. So if someone is opening a McDonald's or Burger King or Kentucky Fried Chicken, they have almost a box kit of how to run the business, what it must look like, where and how marketing will appear, and even how to prepare the food down to each and every step. So it's a recipe for success, if you will. Next, we have direct investing. This is the highest level of involvement and commitment, and also the most expensive. But it does give the company the most control over their own assets. One version of direct investing is to form a joint venture. This could be a type of partnership that companies use in order to get involved in a specific country or market. This is a visual representation of different strategies to enter international markets. We've just discussed these, but now we're looking at them specifically in the context of the ownership that they provide a company and the cost of using that method to engage in international business. As I mentioned to you, exporting is the cheapest and easiest way to start. And as we go along our list, we see that outsourcing, licensing, franchising, joint ventures all increase in cost and commitment by ownership. By far the most expensive way to enter international business is by acquisition or greenfield venture, where the company is making a huge financial investment in obtaining a presence in a foreign market. Doing business in the international environment means that planning, organizing, leading, and controlling needs to happen across multiple countries, and this can be quite challenging. And there are several examples of misadventures that companies have had in this regard. Coca-Cola's brand name, when it was first marketed in China, for example, was translated as "bite the wax tadpole." You can imagine that that didn't do wonders for sales. Colgate launched a toothpaste in France that they named Q, without doing their homework and realizing that that is also the name of a pornographic magazine in France. Ford blundered when they marketed their Pinto car in Brazil because that term in Brazilian Portuguese means tiny male genitals. Also not so helpful for their sales. But perhaps the most interesting example is Gerber baby food that marketed baby food in Africa with a very cute picture of a baby on the label, without knowing that specifically in Ethiopia, products usually have on the label what's inside. And so Ethiopians were quite put off the Gerber brand. Managers must be very mindful of operating in this marketplace. The key factors when operating in the international environment should remind you of our analysis of the external business environment, as these are the very same factors that companies will have to consider before entering a market. They'll have to look at the economic conditions, the legal political environment, and the sociocultural beliefs in that country, and how each of these components influence the organization. When considering the economic environment, companies have to look at the economic development of the country that they want to enter. Countries are categorized according to their per capita income as either developed or developing. Developing countries, of course, are very interesting to businesses because it often means that the market size is going to increase dramatically. In India, for example, economic growth meant that the middle class would burgeon to 200 million people, an attractive prospect for any multinational. But they also have to pay attention to government policies. Will policies make it difficult, for example, for them to take money into or out of the country? They have to pay attention to the maturity of financial markets, perhaps the stock exchange or the strength of banks, and then, of course, the infrastructure that makes it possible for them to trade in that country.
On the topic of the economic environment of business, let's consider the competitiveness of different nations. The World Economic Forum annually compiles a report to rank this. They take many soft and hard measures, such as expert opinions from business leaders, into consideration. They also consider government policies, the size of the market, how sophisticated financial markets are, and various other measures that drive the productivity and sustainability of economies. What's interesting is that in 2011, the United States was 5th on this list, but by 2018 it had reached the first spot. Look where South Africa is stated on this list, at 67. And let's see what that reveals about some of the other trends. The countries that are generally at the top of the ranks are developed countries, more sophisticated economies, countries that would often be referred to as first world or developed nations. And the countries that occupy slightly lower rankings, sometimes much lower rankings, are what we would normally describe as developing or emerging, facing opportunity, but in the midst of significant challenges, such as some of the higher unemployment rates and lower per capita income.
What's become very clear in the economic environment is that there is a high degree of interdependence between countries. Economic crises, which seem to be the order of the day, have highlighted how interconnected economies are. If there is an announcement about Brexit, it affects several stock exchanges around the world. And every time there is a new tariff in the China-America trade war, it does affect the South African Stock Exchange, although it's sometimes difficult to track exactly where the impact is coming from. But this idea of economic contagion is very important when considering the economic environment.
The Misery Index is compiled annually and gives some insight into how countries are bearing the economic crisis differently. What the index does is it adds together a country's unemployment rate and inflation, as well as bank lending rates, and it minuses the percentage change in real GDP per capita. It then uses these figures to suggest greater misery, as we can see in the table here, for the people of Venezuela, even on just a year-by-year basis between 2018 and 2019, a reflection of a lot of the real challenges that they are facing and the significant difficulty that they're experiencing in maintaining their standards of living. We can see this pattern reflected in many other countries, although this is just a sample of data. And what it also reveals to us is how interconnected global markets are. If you look at previous versions of this graph, you will see, for example, how the recession in 2008, or the housing market bubble that burst in the United States of America, increased the misery in countries as far away as Iceland.
The next dimension that has a very important bearing on engaging in international business is the legal political environment. And there are two specific additions to what we've mentioned in this regard. The first is political risk. If we engage in business in this new country, what is the risk that we as a company are going to lose assets or earning power or potentially managerial control? If you think about the philosophy that has been dominant in Zimbabwe recently, there has been a process of indigenization, which means that companies have to hand over up to 50% of their shares and earning equity to indigenous Zimbabwean residents. And this has been a very interesting thing for companies to look at, because it means that they've made the capital investment, but they have to forego future earnings. However, there are some very lucrative businesses in these countries, and many companies have continued to operate there. Nonetheless, a risk that they have to evaluate. Political instability is another consideration. What is the risk of riots, revolutions, civil disorders? And is there a risk of a frequent change in government? If you look, for example, at the Arab Spring, a country like Egypt was particularly affected. They had a very high rate of tourism, but because of the Arab Spring, many tourists were wary of going there after the riots. And in fact, tourism, which was a huge contributor to their economy, declined significantly, which led not only to political instability, but also to economic suffering. The last dimension we have to consider is the socio-cultural environment. And here we need to look at the values and behaviors that govern business, because what works in one country or what's acceptable does not always translate into other environments. We're talking specifically about the social and cultural values and, of course, communication differences. We'll take a closer look at these elements in the next lecture.